What would you do if armed attackers stormed your wedding ceremony? Most people would run, hide, or freeze in terror. But Sarah Martinez wasn't most people. When 12 masked gunmen burst through the chapel doors on what should have been the happiest day of her life, they had no idea they were about to face a former Marine who had survived 3 combat tours in Afghanistan. This is the shocking true story of how one bride's military training turned a nightmare wedding into an unforgettable fight for survival. What happened next would make headlines around the world and prove that sometimes the most beautiful dress can hide the heart of a warrior. The attackers thought they were targeting a helpless celebration. They were dead wrong. Sarah Martinez stood before the full-length mirror in the bridal suite of St. Catherine's Chapel, adjusting the delicate lace on her grandmother's wedding dress. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the white satin fabric. After 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan and countless nights wondering if she would ever find peace, this moment felt like a dream she was afraid to believe in. Her maid of honor, Jessica, carefully pinned the final curl into place. The 2 women had been best friends since childhood, and Jessica was one of the few people who truly understood what this day meant to Sarah. She had seen Sarah through the darkest periods of her military service, the sleepless nights after returning home, and the long journey of healing that had led her to this moment. "You look absolutely stunning," Jessica whispered, stepping back to admire her work. "Michael is going to lose his mind when he sees you walking down that aisle." Sarah smiled, but her trained eyes were already scanning the room out of habit. Even on the happiest day of her life, the instincts developed during her time as a Marine combat engineer never fully switched off. She noticed the emergency exits, the potential cover points, and the sight lines from the windows. It was second nature now, like breathing. Michael Thompson had entered her life 2 years ago when she was working as a security consultant for a tech company in Denver. He was the company's lead software developer, quiet and gentle in a way that initially made Sarah nervous. She was used to the aggressive confidence of fellow soldiers, not the soft-spoken intelligence of a man who solved problems with code instead of weapons. Their first date had been awkward. Michael had chosen a crowded restaurant downtown, and Sarah spent most of the evening positioned where she could see all the exits. When he asked about her military service, she gave him the standard abbreviated version she used for civilians. But something about his genuine curiosity and lack of judgment made her gradually open up over the following months. Michael never pushed her to share more than she was comfortable with, but he also never treated her like she was fragile or broken. He seemed to understand that her experiences had shaped her into someone strong and capable, not someone who needed to be fixed or saved. When she finally told him about the IED explosion that had killed 2 of her closest friends during her second deployment, he simply held her hand and told her he was honored that she trusted him enough to share something so personal. The proposal had come 6 months later during a quiet evening at home. No grand gestures or public displays, just Michael getting down on one knee in their living room after dinner and telling her that he wanted to spend every remaining day of his life making sure she felt safe and loved. The ring was simple and elegant, exactly what she would have chosen for herself. Planning the wedding had been an exercise in compromise between Sarah's preference for small and intimate and their family's desire for a proper celebration. They settled on St. Catherine's Chapel, a beautiful but modest church that could accommodate about 100 guests. Sarah's Marine unit buddies would be there, along with Michael's college friends and extended family. The guest list included people from every chapter of Sarah's life. Her commanding officer from Afghanistan, Lieutenant Colonel Roberts, had flown in from North Carolina. Her squad members from her first deployment were coming from various parts of the country. Even her old drill instructor from boot camp, Sergeant Major Williams, who was now retired, had made the trip to see one of his former recruits get married. Security had been a concern from the beginning. Sarah's work as a combat engineer had put her in some dangerous situations, and she had made enemies among insurgent groups during her deployments. The FBI had briefed her on potential threats when she returned stateside, but nothing specific had materialized in the 3 years since her discharge. Still, she had insisted on some basic precautions. The church had been swept by professional security the night before, and there were 2 off-duty police officers among the guests who were aware of the potential risks. Sarah had also positioned several of her Marine friends strategically throughout the chapel. To most observers, they would just look like groomsmen and guests, but Sarah knew that each one was armed and alert. Michael had initially been uncomfortable with these measures, preferring to believe that their wedding day would be free from such concerns. But he had learned to trust Sarah's judgment about security matters, especially after she explained some of the threats she had faced overseas. He understood that these precautions weren't paranoia, but professional competence. The bridesmaids finished their final preparations in the adjacent room. Besides Jessica, there were 3 other women who had played important roles in Sarah's life. Maria Santos had served alongside her in Afghanistan and now worked as a military contractor. Jennifer Walsh was her college roommate who had kept in touch throughout Sarah's deployments. And Lisa Chun was a fellow veteran she had met in a support group after returning home. All 4 women understood that this wedding represented more than just the union of 2 people in love. For Sarah, it symbolized her successful transition from warrior to civilian, from someone defined by conflict to someone building a life based on peace and partnership. The fact that she could stand here in a wedding dress, planning a future with someone she loved, was its own kind of victory. The men were getting ready in a separate building across the courtyard. Michael's groomsmen included his brother David, his college roommate Jake, and 3 friends from work. Sarah's Marine friends who were serving as honorary groomsmen included Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Corporal Johnson, and Private First Class Miller, who had all served under her command at various points. Father McKenna, who would be performing the ceremony, had spent considerable time with both Sarah and Michael during their pre-marriage counseling sessions. He understood the unique challenges that military couples faced, and he had worked hard to create a ceremony that honored both Sarah's service and their shared future. The chapel itself was decorated simply but elegantly. White roses and baby's breath adorned the altar, and candles flickered in ornate holders along the walls. The afternoon sun would be streaming through the tall windows by the time the ceremony began, creating the perfect atmosphere for their vows. Sarah's parents, Thomas and Helen Martinez, had arrived from their home in Texas the day before. Her father was a retired Army sergeant who understood military culture, but he had still struggled with his daughter's decision to serve in combat. Her mother was a teacher who had spent Sarah's deployments in a constant state of worry, checking the news obsessively for reports from Afghanistan. Both parents were enormously proud of their daughter's service, but they were also relieved that this chapter of her life was beginning. They saw Michael as a stabilizing influence who could help Sarah continue her transition to civilian life. The fact that he clearly adored their daughter and treated her with the respect she deserved made him an easy addition to their family. Michael's parents, Robert and Patricia Thompson, came from a different background entirely. Robert was a college professor, and Patricia worked in social services. Neither had any connection to the military, and they had initially been somewhat intimidated by Sarah's background. But they quickly realized that beneath the competent exterior was a woman who made their son happier than they had ever seen him. The morning proceeded smoothly with the usual pre-wedding activities. Photos were taken, final touches were applied to makeup and hair, and nervous energy was channeled into last-minute preparations. Sarah felt surprisingly calm, which she attributed to both her military training and her certainty that she was making the right decision. At 11:30, the wedding party began making their way to the chapel. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at noon, and guests were already arriving and taking their seats. Sarah could hear the gentle murmur of conversation and the soft notes of the string quartet Michael had insisted on hiring. Jessica handed Sarah her bouquet, a simple arrangement of white roses and eucalyptus that complemented the dress perfectly. The flowers had been chosen for their meaning as much as their beauty. White roses symbolized new beginnings, while eucalyptus represented protection and strength. Sarah took a final look in the mirror and saw not just a bride, but a woman who had survived war and found love, who had learned to channel her strength in service of others, and was now ready to build something beautiful with the person she trusted most in the world. The photographer captured these final moments of preparation, and then it was time to walk across the courtyard to the chapel. Sarah's father would be waiting there to escort her down the aisle. In just 30 minutes, she would be Mrs. Sarah Thompson, and this new chapter of her life would officially begin. None of them had any idea that 12 armed men were already in position around the chapel grounds, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The attackers had been planning this operation for months, studying the layout of the church, the security measures, and the timing of the ceremony. They knew about Sarah's military background, and they thought they had planned for every contingency. What they didn't understand was that training never really leaves a person, and that the most dangerous opponent is often the one who appears most vulnerable. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Sarah had learned about combat, leadership, and survival. Her wedding day was about to become a battlefield, and she would have to choose between the life she was trying to build and the warrior she had trained to be. As Sarah stepped out of the bridal suite and began walking toward the chapel, she noticed that the day was almost too perfect. The sky was clear, the temperature was ideal, and everything had gone according to plan. In her experience, days that started out perfect had a way of taking unexpected turns. She was about to discover just how right that instinct would prove to be. The ceremony had been underway for exactly 12 minutes when Sarah first noticed something was wrong. She was standing at the altar beside Michael, listening to Father McKenna read from Corinthians, when her peripheral vision caught movement that didn't belong. Through the tall stained glass windows, she saw a figure in dark clothing moving too quickly and too deliberately through the tree line that bordered the chapel grounds. Her training kicked in instantly, but she forced herself to remain still and continue listening to the priest. One of the most important lessons from her combat experience was that premature reaction could be more dangerous than patience. She needed to assess the full scope of the threat before taking action. Michael was holding her hand and smiling, completely absorbed in the moment. The guests were focused on the ceremony, many of them wiping away tears as Father McKenna spoke about the sacred bond of marriage. No one else seemed to have noticed anything unusual, which meant Sarah had perhaps 30 seconds to figure out what was happening before the situation escalated. She used those seconds to scan the chapel systematically. Her Marine friends were positioned exactly where she had suggested, but she could see from their body language that they hadn't yet detected the threat. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was standing near the back of the chapel, but his attention was on the ceremony rather than security. Corporal Johnson was seated in the third row on the groom's side, and Private First Class Miller was near the side door that led to the parish hall. Through the windows on the opposite side of the chapel, Sarah caught sight of another figure moving through the shadows. This one was carrying something that looked like a rifle case. Her heart rate accelerated, but her breathing remained steady. The combat breathing techniques she had learned in Marine training were automatic now, as natural as walking. Father McKenna was asking Michael to repeat his vows, which meant they were about halfway through the ceremony. If this was a coordinated attack, the timing suggested that the attackers wanted maximum impact with minimum chance of escape for the targets. Sarah realized that she and Michael were probably the primary objectives, but everyone in the chapel was now at risk. She made eye contact with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and gave him the slightest nod toward the windows. He was sharp enough to catch the signal and immediately began his own assessment of the situation. Within seconds, she saw his posture change subtly as he identified the same threats she had spotted. The first gunshot came just as Michael was saying the words "in sickness and in health." The sound echoed through the chapel like thunder, immediately followed by screams from the guests and the crash of the main doors being kicked open. 12 men in dark tactical clothing and ski masks poured into the chapel, assault rifles raised and ready. Sarah's mind shifted into combat mode instantly. Time seemed to slow down as her training took over, and She began processing information at the accelerated pace that had kept her alive through multiple firefights in Afghanistan. The attackers were using military-style entry tactics, which meant they had some level of professional training. Their weapons were AR-15 style rifles, and they were wearing body armor. The leader of the group, identifiable by his position and the way the others deferred to him, shouted commands in accented English. Sarah immediately recognized the accent as Middle Eastern, possibly Afghan or Pakistani. This wasn't a random attack or a robbery gone wrong. These men were here specifically for her. "Everyone on the ground now," the leader screamed, firing another shot into the air. "Nobody moves, nobody dies." Most of the guests immediately dropped to the floor, terror overriding any other instinct. But Sarah remained standing at the altar, her mind racing through tactical options. Michael was frozen beside her, his face pale with shock and confusion. Father McKenna had ducked behind the altar, and the string quartet had abandoned their instruments and were huddled together near the sidewall. Two of the attackers moved to secure the main exits, while four others spread out along the sides of the chapel, positioning themselves to control the entire space. The remaining six formed a semicircle around the altar area, their weapons trained on Sarah and Michael. "Sarah Martinez," the leader called out, removing his mask to reveal a scarred face that Sarah recognized immediately. It was Khalil Nazir, a Taliban commander she had encountered during her second deployment. His compound had been one of the targets she had helped destroy, and several of his men had been killed in the operation. "You remember me," Nazir said with a cold smile. "Good. I have traveled very far to attend your wedding." Sarah kept her expression neutral, but her mind was analyzing every detail of the situation. Nazir's presence confirmed that this was a revenge operation, probably funded and organized by the same network she had fought against in Afghanistan. The fact that he had tracked her to Colorado and planned this elaborate attack meant that the threat was more serious than the FBI had estimated. "Let these people go," Sarah said calmly, her voice carrying the authority she had developed as a squad leader. "Your problem is with me, not them." Nazir laughed harshly. "Your problem is that you think like a soldier. These people are here because they love you. Yes? That makes them part of your weakness. In Afghanistan, you destroy my family. Today, I destroy yours." The tactical situation was challenging. 12 armed attackers against approximately 100 unarmed civilians meant that any direct confrontation would result in massive casualties. But Sarah could see that several of her Marine friends were positioned advantageously, and she knew that at least 2 guests were off-duty police officers who would likely be armed. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez caught her eye and made a subtle hand signal asking for instructions. Sarah responded with a signal for hold position, indicating that he should wait for her lead before taking action. Premature movement could trigger a massacre. Michael finally found his voice. "What do you want?" he asked, stepping slightly forward to shield Sarah. It was a brave gesture, but tactically it put him in more danger without improving their overall position. "I want her to understand what it feels like to lose everything," Nazir replied. "In Afghanistan, she took my sons, my brothers, my home. Today, she will watch everyone she cares about die, and then she will join them." Sarah calculated the distances and angles quickly. The nearest attacker was about 8 feet away, well within range if she could create a distraction. Her wedding dress was a problem, but not insurmountable. She had trained in restrictive clothing before, and she knew how to move effectively despite the fabric. The bigger challenge was coordination. Any successful resistance would require split-second timing and perfect communication with her allies in the crowd. One mistake could result in a bloodbath that would haunt her for the rest of her life, however long that might be. "You made one mistake, Khalil," Sarah said, using his first name to establish psychological pressure. "You assumed that being in a wedding dress makes me helpless." Before he could respond, she made eye contact with Jessica, who was crouched behind the altar with the other bridesmaids. Sarah gave her a look that Jessica immediately understood. They had practiced emergency procedures together countless times, both in childhood games and later when Sarah was training for deployment. Jessica nodded almost imperceptibly and began shifting position to give Sarah the angle she needed. At the same time, Sarah noticed that Corporal Johnson was slowly reaching for something inside his jacket. She hoped it was the service pistol she knew he was licensed to carry, but she also knew that any weapons discharge in this confined space could trigger panic that would be as dangerous as the attackers themselves. The key was to create enough confusion and tactical advantage to turn the situation around without causing a stampede that could trample the very people she was trying to protect. Sarah had faced similar challenges in Afghanistan, but never with stakes this personal. "Last chance," Nazir said, raising his rifle toward Michael. "Get on your knees, or I start shooting your friends." Sarah made her decision. She had spent years learning to fight in impossible situations, and she had never backed down from a threat to innocent people. Her wedding day was supposed to be about celebrating love and commitment, but it had become about something even more fundamental: the willingness to risk everything to protect the people who mattered most. "Michael," she said quietly, "when I move, you go left and get behind the altar. Don't argue, just do it." Michael looked confused, but something in Sarah's tone convinced him to nod his agreement. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the familiar calm that always preceded combat. Her training had prepared her for this moment, even if she had never imagined it would come while she was wearing her grandmother's wedding dress. The transformation from bride to warrior was about to begin, and Khalil Nazir was about to discover that some people refuse to be victims, no matter what the circumstances. Time seemed to freeze for a moment as Sarah prepared to launch the most important battle of her life. The stakes could not have been higher, and failure was not an option. Everyone she loved was counting on her to become the Marine she had trained to be. The wedding ceremony was over. The fight for survival was about to begin. In that instant before the action started, Sarah thought about all the training that had brought her to this point. The countless hours on the firing range, the hand-to-hand combat drills, the tactical exercises that had seemed like games but were actually preparation for life-or-death situations exactly like this one. She had never wanted to use those skills again, especially not on what should have been the happiest day of her life. But choice was a luxury that Khalil Nazir had taken away from her when he decided to bring violence into her sacred moment. Now there was only training, instinct, and the unbreakable determination to protect the people she loved. The bride was about to disappear, and the Marine was about to take her place. Sarah's movement was so fast and precise that it caught even the train attackers off guard. In one fluid motion, she grabbed the heavy brass candlestick from the altar and hurled it at the nearest gunman while simultaneously diving behind the marble altar rail. The candlestick struck him in the face with a sickening crack, and his rifle clattered to the floor as he stumbled backward, blood streaming from his nose. The chapel erupted into chaos. Guests screamed and scrambled for cover while the attackers tried to regain control of the situation. But Sarah had anticipated this confusion and was already moving to her next objective. She rolled across the floor behind the altar, her wedding dress gathering dirt and tearing on the stone, until she reached the fallen rifle. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez took his cue from Sarah's attack and launched himself at the gunman nearest him. Years of combat experience and physical training made the confrontation brief and decisive. Rodriguez had the man disarmed and unconscious within seconds, claiming a second weapon for their defense. Nazir was shouting orders in Pashto, trying to regain control of his men and the situation, but the tactical advantage he had counted on was evaporating rapidly. His intelligence about Sarah had been accurate regarding her military background, but had severely underestimated her willingness to fight in this environment. Sarah came up from behind the altar with the captured rifle, her muscle memory taking over as she checked the weapon and chamber round. The familiar weight of the AR-15 in her hands was both comforting and disturbing. She had hoped never to hold a weapon in anger again, but Nazir had made that choice for her. Michael had followed her instructions and was crouched behind the stone altar, his face pale but determined. "Sarah, what can I do?" he whispered urgently. "Stay down and help anyone who's wounded," she replied without taking her eyes off the tactical situation. "And if something happens to me, make sure everyone knows this isn't over. These men will keep coming." Two of the attackers were trying to flank the altar from opposite sides. Sarah could hear their footsteps on the stone floor, and she knew she had perhaps 10 seconds before they would have clear shots at her position. The marble altar provided good cover from the front, but it wouldn't protect her from a coordinated assault from multiple angles. Corporal Johnson had managed to draw his concealed pistol and was positioned behind one of the thick stone pillars that supported the chapel roof. He made eye contact with Sarah and signaled that he was ready to provide covering fire. She nodded and indicated the attacker approaching from the left side. Private First Class Miller was still near the side door, but he was unarmed and surrounded by panicked guests. Sarah could see him trying to move people toward the emergency exits, but several of the attackers were specifically positioned to prevent any escape attempts. The tactical situation required split-second decision-making of the type Sarah had learned during urban warfare training in Afghanistan. She had to neutralize immediate threats while protecting civilians and coordinating with her allies. The challenge was doing all of this while wearing a wedding dress in a space filled with people she cared about. Sarah made her move just as the flanking attackers reached their positions. She rolled out from behind the altar, fired 3 quick shots at the man approaching from the right, and immediately shifted to engage the second threat. Her shots were precise and controlled, aimed to disable rather than kill, but still effective enough to remove the immediate danger. The first attacker went down with a bullet in his shoulder, dropping his weapon and clutching his wound. The second man dove for cover behind the pews, giving Johnson a clear shot that he took without hesitation. His police training showed as he placed 2 rounds center mass, ending that threat permanently. Nazir was becoming increasingly agitated as his carefully planned operation fell apart. He had expected to face a bride, not a combat veteran who was systematically dismantling his team. His remaining men were good fighters, but they were not prepared for this level of organized resistance. "Kill them all," he screamed in English, abandoning any pretense of taking prisoners. "Burn this place down." 3 of his men produced incendiary devices from their packs, confirming Sarah's worst fears about their intentions. This wasn't just a revenge killing. It was planned as a massacre that would destroy the chapel and everyone in it. The fire would eliminate evidence and ensure that no witnesses survived to identify the attackers. Sarah realized that the stakes had just escalated beyond anything she had imagined. A firefight was one thing, but an incendiary attack in a confined space filled with civilians was a nightmare scenario that required immediate action. She spotted Maria Santos, one of her bridesmaids and fellow Afghanistan veteran, positioned near the main entrance. Maria had managed to acquire a weapon from one of the downed attackers and was covering the exit to prevent reinforcements from entering. Her military training was evident in her stance and weapon handling. "Maria," Sarah called out, using hand signals to communicate over the noise. "Incendiaries! Stop them!" Maria immediately understood the threat and shifted her position to engage the attackers with the fire devices. Her first shots forced them to take cover, buying precious time, but not eliminating the danger. The chapel had become a 3-dimensional battlefield with civilians caught in the crossfire. Sarah had to consider not just the immediate tactical situation, but also the long-term survival of everyone in the building. If those incendiaries were deployed, the wooden pews and decorative materials would create a firestorm that could kill dozens of people within minutes. Father McKenna was still behind the altar, trying to comfort several elderly guests who had been unable to move quickly enough to find better cover. Sarah could see that he was struggling with his own fear, but was putting the welfare of others above his personal safety. "Father," Sarah called out, "there's an emergency exit behind the vestry. Can you get these people out that way?" "The door is locked," he replied, his voice shaking. "I have the key in the sacristy, but it's across the chapel." Sarah made a quick calculation. The sacristy was behind enemy lines now, but getting that door open could save lives if the situation continued to deteriorate. She would have to fight her way across the chapel and back, all while the attackers were trying to burn the place down. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had worked his way along the wall toward the main entrance, using the stone pillars for cover. He was in position to support Maria if she needed backup, but he was also cut off from Sarah's position near the altar. The tactical coordination that Sarah had hoped for was becoming increasingly difficult as the battle spread throughout the chapel. Each of her allies was fighting their own engagement, and communication was nearly impossible over the sound of gunfire and screaming. One of the attackers with an incendiary device managed to light it and threw it toward the wooden pews on the left side of the chapel. The device immediately began producing thick smoke and intense heat, confirming Sarah's fears about their intentions. The smoke created both an opportunity and a crisis. It would provide concealment for movement, but it would also make breathing difficult and could cause panic among the guests. Sarah had to act quickly before the situation became completely unmanageable. She sprinted from behind the altar toward the sacristy, keeping low and using the smoke for cover. Bullets whined past her head, but the poor visibility was working in her favor as much as theirs. Her wedding dress was now completely ruined, torn, and blackened with smoke and dirt, but it was no longer restricting her movement significantly. The key to the emergency exit was in a small cabinet behind the altar table in the sacristy. Sarah reached the door and found it unlocked, probably because Father McKenna had been preparing for the ceremony earlier. She grabbed the key and immediately turned to head back toward the emergency exit. But as she emerged from the sacristy, she found herself face to face with Khalil Nazir, who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. He had positioned himself where he could control access to both the altar area and the emergency exit, effectively trapping Sarah between the fire and his position. "So the bride becomes a soldier," he said, his rifle trained on her center mass. "But you're still going to die today, along with everyone you love." Sarah kept her own weapon ready, but didn't immediately raise it. At this range, whoever shot first would likely win, but the confined space and proximity to civilians made any exchange of fire extremely dangerous. "Your men are down, Khalil," she said, trying to buy time while she assessed her options. "This operation failed. You can still walk away from this." He laughed bitterly. "I did not come here to walk away. I came here to watch you suffer as I have suffered. The fire will do that even if you kill me." Sarah could smell the smoke getting thicker and hear the crackling of flames beginning to spread to the wooden furnishings. Time was running out not just for her, but for everyone trapped in the chapel. She had to end this confrontation quickly and get people out of the building before the fire made escape impossible. Behind Nazir, she could see Michael trying to help an elderly woman who had fallen during the initial attack. He was completely exposed, and Sarah realized that Nazir could turn and shoot him at any moment. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she was running out of options that didn't involve significant risk to innocent people. The key to the emergency exit was in her left hand, her rifle was in her right, and between her and the door that could save lives stood a man who had traveled thousands of miles to kill her and everyone she cared about. Sarah made her choice. She had been trained to accept risk in order to complete the mission, and her mission now was saving lives. The bride had been replaced entirely by the Marine, and the Marine knew what had to be done. The final confrontation was about to begin, and only one of them would walk away from it. The moment stretched like a held breath between Sarah and Khalil Nazir. Behind him, the chapel was filling with smoke as the fire spread along the wooden pews. The screams of trapped guests echoed off the stone walls, and Sarah could hear Maria Santos and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez still engaging the remaining attackers near the main entrance. "You hesitate," Nazir observed, noting Sarah's failure to immediately raise her weapon. "That is why you Americans lose wars. You care too much about the wrong people." Sarah's mind was processing multiple scenarios simultaneously, the way her combat training had taught her to think under extreme pressure. She could shoot Nazir, but his finger was already on the trigger and his reflexes were good enough that he might get a shot off before he fell. She could dive for cover, but that would leave him free to hunt down Michael and the others. Or she could try something unexpected. "You're right that I care about people," Sarah replied, taking a half step to her right. "That's what makes me stronger than you, not weaker." As she spoke, she was calculating angles and distances. The emergency exit key in her left hand could become a distraction if thrown properly. Her rifle could be brought to bear in less than a second if she created the right opening. And behind Nazir, she could see Michael slowly moving the elderly woman toward what he thought was safety, but was actually directly into the line of fire. The smoke was getting thicker, which meant visibility would deteriorate rapidly. That could work in Sarah's favor if she could use it to break visual contact and reposition, but it also increased the danger for everyone trying to evacuate. She could hear Father McKenna coughing somewhere behind her, and she knew the elderly guest would be especially vulnerable to smoke inhalation. Nazir shifted his stance slightly, and Sarah immediately recognized the movement as preparation to fire. His breathing had changed, and his grip on the rifle had tightened. She had perhaps 2 seconds before he pulled the trigger. Sarah made her move with the fluid precision that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of training. She threw the emergency exit key hard at Nazir's face while simultaneously dropping to one knee and bringing her rifle up. The key struck him in the forehead, not hard enough to cause serious damage, but sufficient to make him flinch and spoil his aim. His shot went high, the bullet striking the stone wall where Sarah's head had been a split second earlier. Sarah's return fire was more accurate. She put 2 rounds into his chest, aiming for the center mass target that would stop the threat without risking overpenetration that could endanger others. Nazir staggered backward, but didn't go down immediately. His body armor had absorbed most of the impact, though the kinetic energy had clearly stunned him. Sarah adjusted her aim and fired again, this time targeting his weapon instead of his body. The rifle was knocked from his hands, clattering across the stone floor. But Nazir wasn't finished. As he fell, he pulled a grenade from his vest and fumbled with the pin. Sarah realized that he was willing to bring down the entire chapel rather than accept defeat. The grenade would not only kill everyone in the immediate area, but could also cause structural damage that would trap people in the burning building. Sarah didn't hesitate. She launched herself forward, tackling Nazir before he could complete his action. They hit the floor hard, with Sarah using her momentum to drive his hand against the stone. The grenade flew free, its pin still intact, spinning across the floor toward the altar. The hand-to-hand combat that followed was brief, but vicious. Nazir was larger and stronger, but Sarah had the advantage of superior training and desperation. She used leverage and technique to compensate for the physical disadvantage, applying a chokehold that she had perfected during countless training sessions. Nazir struggled fiercely, trying to reach a knife on his belt, but Sarah maintained her position and pressure until he lost consciousness. She immediately secured his weapons and checked for other threats, her combat instincts keeping her alert even after neutralizing the immediate danger. The tactical situation had changed dramatically in the past few minutes. The smoke was now thick enough to seriously impair visibility, and Sarah could hear the crackling of flames that meant the fire was spreading beyond what could be easily controlled. She had to get people out of the building immediately. "Michael," she called out, grabbing the emergency exit key from where it had fallen. "Get everyone toward the back exit. Now." Michael appeared out of the smoke, supporting the elderly woman Sarah had seen him helping earlier. His face was streaked with soot, and he was coughing, but he was moving with purpose and determination. "How many people are still inside?" Sarah asked as she worked to unlock the emergency exit. "I don't know," Michael replied. "Maybe 20 or 30. Father McKenna was trying to account for everyone, but the smoke is getting too thick to see much." Sarah got the door open and immediately felt the rush of fresh air from outside. The contrast made her realize just how toxic the atmosphere in the chapel had become. People were going to start collapsing from smoke inhalation if they didn't get out soon. "Start moving people through here," she told Michael. "I need to check on the others and make sure we didn't miss anyone." Maria Santos appeared through the smoke, supporting Private First Class Miller, who had taken a bullet in the leg during the fighting. Behind them came several guests, all coughing and stumbling but moving under their own power. "Rodriguez is still inside," Maria reported. "He was covering the main entrance, but I lost contact with him when the smoke got thick." Sarah made a quick decision. The building was becoming increasingly dangerous, but she couldn't abandon Rodriguez or anyone else who might still be trapped inside. Her Marine training had taught her that you never left people behind, regardless of the personal risk. "Get everyone out through this exit," she instructed Maria. "I'm going back for Rodriguez and anyone else still inside." "Sarah, no," Michael protested, grabbing her arm. "The whole place is going to go up. You can't save everyone." She looked at him with the same expression she had worn when explaining her security concerns before the wedding. "Yes, I can. That's what I do." Before he could argue further, Sarah plunged back into the smoke-filled chapel. The heat was becoming intense, and she could see flames spreading across the ceiling in some areas. The wooden roof beams were beginning to char, and she knew the structural integrity of the building was compromised. She made her way toward the main entrance, calling out for Rodriguez. The visibility was so poor that she was navigating largely by memory and the layout she had memorized during the security sweep the day before. "Rodriguez," she shouted. "Sound off." "Here," came a weak reply from near the front pews. Sarah followed the voice and found Rodriguez trapped under a beam that had fallen from the ceiling. He was conscious but couldn't move his legs, and there was blood on his forehead from where debris had struck him. "How bad?" Sarah asked, quickly assessing his injuries. "Legs are pinned, but I don't think anything's broken," he replied. "There are 3 more guests behind the organ. I couldn't get to them before this beam came down." Sarah looked around for something she could use as a lever to lift the beam. The chapel was filled with heavy wooden furniture, but most of it was already burning or too damaged to be useful. She spotted a metal candle stand that might work if she could get the right angle. Working together, Sarah and Rodriguez managed to create enough leverage to lift the beam just high enough for him to crawl out. His legs were badly bruised, but he could stand with support. "Can you make it to the emergency exit?" Sarah asked. "Yeah, but what about those people behind the organ?" Sarah had already started moving in that direction. The organ was a massive instrument that dominated one side of the chapel, and the space behind it was relatively protected from the fire, but also completely cut off from the main exits. She found 3 guests huddled there: an elderly man who was having trouble breathing, a middle-aged woman who appeared to be his daughter, and a young boy who was probably his grandson. The boy was crying, and the adults were clearly in shock. "We're going to get you out of here," Sarah told them with the calm authority that had served her well in Afghanistan. "Follow me and stay low. The smoke will be thick, but we'll be outside in less than a minute." Leading the group back toward the emergency exit was like navigating through a nightmare. The smoke was so thick that Sarah could barely see her own hands, and the heat was becoming unbearable. She had to move slowly enough that the elderly man could keep up while moving quickly enough to get everyone out before the roof collapsed. They emerged from the building just as the first fire trucks arrived. The sound of sirens and the flashing of emergency lights created a surreal contrast to the peaceful wedding ceremony that had been taking place less than an hour earlier. Sarah collapsed on the grass outside the chapel, finally allowing herself to feel the exhaustion and adrenaline crash that followed intense combat. Her wedding dress was completely destroyed, and she was covered in soot and blood, but everyone she cared about was alive. Michael knelt beside her, his face a mixture of relief, admiration, and shock. "Sarah, what you just did in there. I knew you were a Marine, but I never really understood what that meant until today." Emergency medical personnel were treating the wounded, including several of the attackers who had survived the confrontation. Sarah could see FBI agents arriving to begin their investigation, and she knew she would be answering questions for hours about what had happened and why. But for the moment, all that mattered was that the people she loved were safe. The wedding ceremony had been interrupted, the chapel was burning, and her dress was ruined, but she and Michael were alive and together. As she sat on the grass outside the burning chapel, still holding the rifle she had taken from one of the attackers, Sarah realized that her transition from warrior to civilian was going to be more complicated than she had hoped. The war had followed her home, but she had proven that she was ready to fight it on her own terms. The bride had become a warrior again when it mattered most, and she had won the most important battle of her life. 3 hours after the attack began, Sarah sat in the back of an ambulance while a paramedic treated a cut on her arm and checked her lungs for smoke damage. The chapel behind her was still smoldering despite the efforts of 3 fire departments, but the immediate danger had passed. Everyone had been accounted for, and the casualties were far lighter than they could have been. FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh had arrived within 30 minutes of the first emergency call, along with a full tactical response team and evidence collection unit. Sarah had known Walsh from her military service, where they had worked together on joint operations in Afghanistan, and her presence was both reassuring and professionally necessary. Preliminary count shows 12 attackers, all neutralized or in custody, Walsh reported as she approached the ambulance. 4 dead, 8 wounded, and captured. Your people did outstanding work in there, Sarah. Sarah nodded wearily. The adrenaline was wearing off, and she was starting to feel the full impact of what had happened. What about the casualties on our side? 2 wounded guests, both stable and expected to recover fully. Miller took a bullet in the leg, but should be fine. Rodriguez has some bruised ribs and a mild concussion. Considering what you were facing in there, those numbers are miraculous. Michael appeared at Walsh's shoulder, still covered in soot but uninjured. He had spent the past hour helping coordinate the evacuation and providing information to the investigators. His software developer background had proven useful in organizing and managing the chaos that followed the attack. The guests are asking about you, he told Sarah. They want to know if you're okay. Sarah started to stand up, but the paramedic gently pushed her back down. 5 more minutes, he insisted. Your oxygen levels are still a little low. They're probably wondering what happened to their wedding, Sarah said with a tired smile. I don't think this is what they expected when they RSVP'd. Michael sat down beside her on the ambulance bumper. Actually, they're calling you a hero. Father McKenna said he's never seen anything like what you did in there. And your Marine friend are telling everyone that this is exactly the kind of person you've always been. Through the crowd of emergency responders and investigators, Sarah could see her parents talking to a reporter who had somehow gotten past the police perimeter. Her father was gesturing emphatically, and she could tell he was describing her military service to explain how she had been able to handle the attack. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached the ambulance, walking with a slight limp but otherwise appearing to be in good condition. Behind him were Maria Santos and Corporal Johnson, both of whom had been cleared by the medical team. Ma'am, Rodriguez said with a grin, that was some outstanding leadership in there. Reminded me of that operation outside Kandahar, when we had to fight our way out of that compound. This was different, Sarah replied. In Afghanistan, we knew we were going into combat. Today was supposed to be about celebrating peace. Maybe, Johnson said, but when it mattered, you became exactly who you needed to be. Those people in there are alive because you didn't hesitate to fight for them. Special Agent Walsh rejoined the group with a preliminary report. We've identified most of the attackers. Khalil Nazir was the leader, as you suspected. The others were a mixture of Taliban sympathizers and hired mercenaries. This operation was planned for months, and they had significant intelligence about your background and the wedding arrangements. Sarah wasn't surprised by this information, but it was still disturbing to realize how thoroughly her life had been studied and analyzed by people who wanted to kill her. How did they get into the country? That's still under investigation, but it appears they used a combination of forged documents and assistance from domestic sympathizers. This was a sophisticated operation with considerable funding behind it. The implications were troubling. If Nazir's network had the resources and connections to mount an operation like this, there might be other threats that hadn't been identified yet. Sarah's transition to civilian life was going to require ongoing security considerations that she had hoped to leave behind. Michael seemed to be thinking along the same lines. What does this mean for us going forward? Are we going to have to live with this kind of threat permanently? The immediate cell has been neutralized, Walsh replied carefully, but we'll need to conduct a thorough investigation to determine whether there are other connected threats. Sarah will need to maintain security protocols for the foreseeable future. Sarah felt a wave of sadness mixed with her relief. She had hoped that her wedding day would mark the end of her life as a target and the beginning of a peaceful future with Michael. Instead, it had shown her that some aspects of her military experience would follow her indefinitely. But as she looked around at the people who had stood with her during the attack, she also felt a deep sense of gratitude and connection. Her Marine friends had performed exactly as she would have expected, with courage and professionalism under extreme pressure. Michael had shown a strength and adaptability that she hadn't known he possessed. Even the guests had largely kept their composure and followed instructions during the evacuation. Father McKenna approached the group, his clerical robes still stained with smoke, but his expression calm and purposeful. "Sarah, I wanted to tell you personally how grateful I am for what you did today. You saved lives, including mine. You helped save people too, Father," Sarah replied. "You kept everyone calm and focused during the evacuation. I've been thinking about the ceremony," he continued. "Obviously, we weren't able to complete your vows today, but I want you to know that what I witnessed in that chapel was a demonstration of commitment more profound than any words could express." Michael took Sarah's hand. "He's right. What you did in there wasn't just about your military training. It was about protecting the people you love, including me. I've never felt more certain that I want to spend my life with you." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "Even knowing that this kind of thing might happen again? That being with me means living with threats and security concerns that most people never have to think about. Especially knowing that," Michael replied firmly. "I married a Marine today, even if we didn't get to finish the ceremony. I married someone who will fight for what matters, who will protect the people she cares about, and who will never back down from doing what's right." The paramedic finally cleared Sarah to leave the ambulance, and she stood up slowly, testing her balance and breathing. The smoke inhalation had been mild, but she was still feeling the effects of the physical exertion and stress. As she looked back at the damaged chapel, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. The building could be repaired, and the ceremony could be repeated, but the day itself could never be reclaimed. Yet in some ways, what had happened had revealed truths about herself and her relationships that might never have emerged under normal circumstances. "We'll have the ceremony again," she told Michael. "When the chapel is rebuilt, when the investigation is complete, when we've had time to process all of this." "Absolutely," he agreed. "But in a way, we're already married. What happened in there was our real wedding. Everything else is just paperwork and celebration." Special Agent Walsh interrupted their moment with a practical concern. "Sarah, we're going to need extensive debriefings over the next several days, and we'll need to discuss ongoing security arrangements. This attack may be over, but the investigation is just beginning." Sarah nodded, understanding that her transition back to civilian life was going to be more gradual than she had hoped. But she also realized that she had allies and support that many people never experience. Her military family, her new civilian family, and her law enforcement contacts formed a network that could help her navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. As the emergency vehicles began departing and the immediate crisis atmosphere started to fade, Sarah found herself standing in the parking lot of the damaged chapel, surrounded by the people who mattered most to her. Her wedding dress was ruined, her ceremony had been interrupted by violence, and her peaceful future had been complicated by ongoing security concerns. But she was alive, Michael was unharmed, and Everyone she cared about had survived an attack that could easily have been a massacre. In Afghanistan, she had learned to measure success not by perfect outcomes, but by mission accomplishment and the safety of her people. By those standards, her wedding day had been a complete success. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached her with something in his hand. "Ma'am, I thought you might want this back." He was holding her grandmother's engagement ring, which had somehow come off during the fighting, but had been recovered from the chapel floor. Sarah slipped the ring back on her finger, feeling the weight of family history and personal commitment that it represented. "Thank you. I thought it was lost. Some things are too important to lose," Rodriguez replied with a smile. As the sun set behind the mountains surrounding the chapel, Sarah realized that her story was far from over. The attack had ended one chapter of her life, but had also begun another. She would always be a Marine, ready to fight when fighting was necessary. But she was also ready to be a wife, a civilian, and whatever else the future required her to become. The bride had become a warrior when it mattered most, and now the warrior was ready to become something new. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Sarah Martinez Thompson would face them with the same courage, competence, and commitment that had saved lives on what should have been the happiest day of her life. Her wedding day would be remembered not for the ceremony that was interrupted, but for the battle that was won and the lives that were saved. And that, Sarah realized, was exactly the kind of legacy she wanted to build in her new life. The most dangerous wedding day ever had become the first day of the rest of her life, and she was ready for whatever came next.